Guys, I have to apologize because I was wrong about a loadout I showcased, and that showcased only 40% of its actual power. It was the melee influence video with the dual E-cores. That was actually a lot less damage and devastation you could have actually done. What's good, folks? It's Nightmare Frame here with a disgusting melee synergy that you can use to destroy Steel Path, and this is the correct way to do it. The wrong things I showed in my old video were using condition overload and not modding with enough elemental damage and worrying about elemental weighting. Yeah, so this build can work on any frame. You just need to mod accordingly and use a specific Helminth. So if you're not interested in the frames that are showcased in this video, well, any frame can work. Just have the two requirements. Believe it or not, there are people who actually underestimate the power of dual E-cores clouds. Some even comparing it to the Furax's fire patch. Those people should be slapped really hard, repeatedly. With the introduction of the melee influence arcane, dual E-core cloud builds have just been made even deadlier. If you miss any point or are lost, please use the timestamps. If you do happen to ask a question that are already answered in the video, I will get la chancla. But first, let me explain the melee influence arcane. When you read it, it doesn't offer you the full picture. So let me explain. On a melee hit that procs the electric status effect, you have a 20% chance to activate a buff. This buff, once active for the next 18 seconds, and this 18 seconds timer cannot be refreshed while it's active, which is just fine. So for the next 18 seconds, every single status proc, meaning the application of an elemental damage type being applied, coming from your melee weapon, from any melee strike, will be reproduced and spread to any enemy within 20 meters. And this spread does not have any damage fall off, nor any line of sight restrictions. Unfortunately, this does not spread IPS, so no slash procs, which again isn't an issue. The main thing you want to have is electric damage on your weapon, whether it comes from modded element or a Helminth ability that infuses the electric elemental damage on your weapons. For example, Volt's Shock with the Shock Trooper augment. So for consistent activation, you want things that can boost your probability of proccing the electric status effect to trigger the arcane. So that means weapons with high status chance, very fast attack speed, and stances that provide you with multi-hit combos. And even grouping helps. Here is something you need to know. Melee influence inherits the traits of the weapon it originated from, meaning this can synergize with weapons to spread specific damage traits, like Jetkatag's explosions, giving it an additional AoE, Amalgam Argonac armor strip buffs to spread AoE electricity to armor strip enemies within the area. But here, I'm having it trigger multiple AoEs that continue to deal damage over time with the dual E-cores. And here's another thing to note, is that the electric status effect is an AoE in itself. It can chain to multiple enemies, and it's instantaneous, and the electric procs scale off your base damage, elemental damage, and faction damage mods. This has the electric DOT double dip in damage. However, in this case, melee influence reapplies faction bonuses from all previous sources, allowing it to triple dip in its damage. Okay, before I go any further, let me just interject here with dual E-cores, so you can understand its mechanic. Taking a look at its evolution 1, this weapon's Incarnon evolved trait has enemies that you kill drop a toxin cloud that sits there and deals damage over time for the next 7 seconds. These clouds do not crit. They scale with melee base damage, the toxin elemental damage mod present on your weapon, and faction damage mods. The clouds have a 50% status chance, and this status chance is not affected by the status chance mods or the status chance evolution. These clouds that are dropped deal pure toxin damage and do not force proc. However, you have a 50% chance to proc toxin along with your modded elements that are present on your weapon. And again, no physical damage types. And unfortunately, status duration mods do not increase the cloud's lifespan. So when the clouds kill enemies that are close to one another, they overlap on each other, creating additional clouds without you doing anything. So now I'm going back to melee influence. What is essentially happening here is that when you trigger melee influence and those enemies die by influence, also drop a cloud. And no, the clouds do not re-trigger melee influence. But if you have electricity on your weapon, it has a chance to proc the electric status effect, which is an AoE effect that can also confuse some people into thinking that, hey, my clouds just triggered melee influence. No, that's not it. And as I said earlier, you can use any frame with this loadout. You just have to mod it accordingly. But the main thing I'm showing off here is, of course, with Saryn, because it can be even more devastating because she offers 2 elemental damage increases that greatly boost your damage. One of them being Toxic Lash's damage boost, as that allows you to quadruple dip in the damage department and applies alongside melee influence as it becomes part of the weapon's damage and an elemental damage that triggers as a separate instance to your weapon's damage. That was a lot of words, I'm sure. So let me show you how this looks like. On my weapon test dummy here, I'm going to show you all the things that scale Toxic Lash. Now, for those who know what Toxic Lash does, think of it as a glove. So this glove has toxin damage. So when you slap someone, you're essentially hitting them with your hand, but at the same time, this hand is able to apply an elemental damage. So you're getting 2 hits for the price of 1. So Toxic Lash scales off your strength, a percentage of your weapon's damage, and of course it deals 2 times the damage with melees. It scales with your base damage, your elemental damage, and even faction damage mods. And that toxin status effect that you apply can then trigger a second time to deal additional damage, hence the double and triple dipping. And with melee influence spread, it can quad dip because game math. So going back to my dual Ichors. Reminder, melee influence can trigger the clouds, but the clouds cannot trigger melee influence. And the clouds scale off the toxin elemental damage on your weapons. So when you're modding for dual Ichors, you want to have a lot of toxin damage. And this is where I made a mistake in my previous build video where I didn't mod enough elemental damage. So let's take a look at this dual Ichors build. Showcasing here, this build looks very, very weird. Most important thing here you want to have is toxin damage, a lot of it. And you may have noticed I'm modding it for gas and toxin. And why is that so? Because Saryn already provides you with corrosive elemental damage on your weapons thanks to her augment venom dose, and Toxic Lash providing you toxin, which does not combine with any of your elements here, but is a separate instance of damage. And then you also have the Helminth ability that I'll be using, and that Helminth ability is Nourish. Now we have corrosive, viral, and toxin. All of this is increasing our direct damage hit. Nourish is actually a huge boon to our damage, because if you know what viral does, is a damage multiplier and straight up elemental damage, which then greatly boosts our damage and damage over time with our clouds and our direct hits. Then going on to our weapon, which is modded for gas, which is an AoE damage over time, which synergizes really well with your clouds. So when we combine all of that, we're dealing crazy amounts of upfront damage, and our clouds can deal even more damage of their own. Now remember what I said about having elemental weighting. You don't need it here. You don't have to worry about it. Just having this electric elemental damage mod allows us to get melee influence every 9 to 10 hits. And this buff lasts for 18 seconds. So let's go into Steel Path to show you how this build really works. We're building up our status chance and combo. We're still able to trigger melee influence even though we only have one 90% elemental damage mod. I'm going to quickly build up my combo here. All right, here we go. We have our Incarnon activation. Pay attention to what's happening now. Everything around us is then dying. Anything that comes into contact with our clouds dies to then trigger more clouds, causing a crazy cascading effect that can cover an entire map, to the point where these clouds are spawn killing enemies. Look, those guys walked into the clouds, they died, they create more clouds. These guys die, spawning more clouds, and the cycle continues. This turns into a pseudo camping setup. There's an issue to this because you kill enemies so far and wide that loot can just drop everywhere. You would have to go around and pick up your life support. Another thing to note here, we're not using any spores. Spores isn't even required for this build. The only reason I'm keeping my spores is because of Venom Dose, to give us that corrosive elemental damage increase. And as you can see, this is a Rivenless build. If you want to apply a Riven to this weapon, I highly recommend the Toxin elemental damage and base damage to further boost your damage output on the clouds. Look, they're just walking into the clouds and dying, thanks to my Cordon. Cordon, of course, pulls in enemies who are just a bit further away from my clouds so they can die to spawn even more clouds. Another interesting thing about gas is that every enemy will spawn their own gas clouds. Hopefully the Acolyte walks into my clouds and dies. Oh, there he goes, walks into my clouds and he's dying. Beautiful. If you've not seen, this is my recent Rhino build, where I have Nourish on my first ability. The cool thing about Rhino is that he has Roar, and the stronger Roar buff. Roar is a faction damage mod that applies to all your weapons and abilities. And the cool thing is, Rhino is a bit more versatile for your average player, meaning since you have Roar, you could replace the faction damage mod on your weapons. So when we go to this build right now, we have the option of replacing this mod for anything else. So now I can replace it with Focus Rad-On, where it gives us gas, radiation, and electric. This is its own elemental damage mod and does not combine with anything that forms radiation. So this electric does not combine into this radiation. That's why we have separate elemental damage. You get a little bit of growing power, activate Roar. Beautiful. Dead. Walking into us, dead. Dead. You can just hear all of those death cries. But I have something else for you, and that's with Volt. Now, Volt offers you something else. It gives you movement speed and attack speed without needing to mod for it. On top of that, he has Shock, which gives you the electric elemental damage on all your weapons. So that means we can actually drop the electric mod on our dual Ichors. Pretty interesting, right? We have our base damage, faction mods, radiation, with additional toxin damage mods to buff our clouds. Now, here's the thing to note with Shock Trooper. Shock Trooper will combine with your singular modded element present on your weapon. And if your weapon doesn't have any modded elements, an innate element will combine with that. So it always takes priority on the modded element. However, here we already have combined elements. And this is why you have to mod accordingly. And for the people thinking that they can just put a heat mod to form gas on their weapons and have Shock Trooper, sorry to bust your bubble, but you're going to end up with radiation and toxin. As I said, it always takes priority on the modded element. And plus, if you're just modding for heat, your toxin clouds are not going to scale that well. So that's why you have to mod accordingly. We have our second ability to give us attack speed on our melee. So that's why we don't have to worry about modding for Arcane Strike on our Warframe. And we're easily triggering melee influence because we have a lot of electricity. We need to get to 6 times combo. Boom. Now we have our clouds. Look at that spread. Beautiful. Pretty much the same effect. And each frame offers you something unique that the other one doesn't. With Saryn, you get the option of having corrosive, viral, gas, and toxin, along with electric on all your weapons. Rhino gives you the faction multiplier thanks to Roar, while Volt gives you the electric elemental damage mod on your weapons thanks to his Shock Trooper. So you can mod for other things on the weapon. At the same time, he gives you a lot of attack speed with his second ability. Oh, that's beautiful. That is a beautiful cascade. And yes, you can even use a Warframe like Voruna thanks to her Shroud of Dinar, because this gives you 100% status chance, guaranteed slash procs, but of course that does not spread. But then this allows you to forgo modding Weeping Wounds, which gives you another free mod slot. All of these Warframes benefit you in so many different ways to buff this weapon synergy. All the Warframes are going to be using Nourish. Focus School doesn't matter, but for the other ones, if you want some additional boost, you can go for Maturai. All of the builds revolve around having a decent amount of duration, and for this particular Saryn build, you don't need range, because I'm not using spores in the traditional sense. Taking a look at the Saryn build, in the aura I have Steel Charge to give me 60% melee base damage, which goes along with Prime Pressure Point on my weapon and Arcane Fury to give me all of that melee base damage, as the clouds scale off melee base damage and not Condition Overload, which is a conditional melee base damage. It's in the name. As you can see, we're focusing hard on duration and strength. I have multiple Saryn builds on this particular Saryn, but it's actually even better if you ran with primed continuity. So you can have Narrowmind and primed continuity to give you even more duration. Strength at 267% with Umbral Intensify, Blind Rage, and Augur Secrets. Efficiency isn't an issue here because it is running Nourish. And this is a shield gating build, and that's why I have Catalyzing Shields along with Rolling Guard. And with the additional Augur mods, I can convert energy spent into shield, so that's why I don't need to run Brief Respite. And my secondary will have 2 additional Augur mods. Venom Dose is our first ability augment, which gives us the corrosive elemental damage mods when we hold down the ability. As you can see on the secondary, I have 2 Augur mods. With all of these Augur mods combined, when we use energy, we convert that into shields. And since Catalyzing Shield reduces our shield pool, we refresh that. So this turns it into the old school shield gating, where we get that 1.33 seconds of shield gate duration. You've already seen how we modded the weapon for Volt. Let's go on to the actual build. You can run whatever you want in the aura. I went with enemy radar because I'm moving way too fast, so I needed a bigger refresh on my enemy ping on the map. Same situation. Duration and range are the main things you want to have. And over here, I have Shock Trooper instead of Venom Dose. This applies the electric elemental damage mods on all of my weapons. And this is a health tanking loadout, different from the Saryn loadout, as I'm using Arcane Blessing and Arcane Reaper. And because we're using a lot of melee, hey, that's free armor and healing over time. On top of that, I have Archon Stretch, which is paired with a Deriga modded for Arc Coil. This counts as an ability damage that deals electric damage to then trigger Archon Stretch for even more energy regen. That's if you want to do that, as I'm showing you an option. However, Nautilus with Cordon just feels way more comfortable to use for these particular builds. Moving on to the Rhino loadout. Here I have range because I'm using my Stomp, just for some additional crowd control. Strike and Fury, same thing with Saryn. A bunch of strength to boost my roar, and of course Nourish for the energy regen. As you can see, that's one hell of a juicy synergy that you should definitely be trying out right now. And if you love melee, oh, you're going to enjoy this quite a bit. Anyway, folks, that has been it from me. I do have enjoyed this video, and if you did, please feel free to leave a like, share, and subscribe for more Warframe content, streams, and so much more. Do refer to the description. Thanks for watching, and as always, a peace. Bye-bye now.